We were an inexperienced generation that walked on the mines left as a legacy by the Soviet Union and exploded, dying and shrinking at almost every step at the dawn of our national independence. When bloody conflicts erupt, gain strength and last for years, sooner or later, relationships between people built over the years begin to break down, and rarely someone escapes the destructive power of its waves. It seems the cruel laws of war begin to rule the mind. What was an unimaginable the previous day becomes accepted the next day, and step by step we are getting accustomed to it, and after a while we even find a reason to justify that everything. Those bloody confrontations had not passed my life either. When I was about 18, I flew to Moscow with my father for the first time in my life. For me, it was the first time I had ever left the borders of Georgia and the places I had spent all my life. Even as a child, I had been in the countryside only once or twice and spent all my time in Tbilisi. I remember my first feeling when I came back and saw my mulberry tree and even a lamppost on the street near my house, which I had been seeing almost all the days of my life. Even that raised lamppost looked so familiar that it seemed to me as if it was the axis of the earth itself. I noticed one thing. When we go back to our childhood places we were away from for many years, we realize that things are actually smaller than how we perceive them as a child. In other words, as a child, we see things on a bigger scale than they really are. In the beginning of 1990s, those my big and large childhood memories started to shrink one by one. The disintegration of the Soviet Union was accompanied by the opposite reaction of society to atheists, and millions of people turned to different religions. Those who yesterday were pioneers, comsomolets, and communists now were swept in different directions by new tides of life. At that time, I started seeking God and His ways. I was one of those who tried to find a solution to an almost desperate situation during those bloody conflicts and upheavals in Georgia in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Once walking down the street, I met my friend from school, and she told me that she attended Orthodox services and encouraged me to go with her. It was around 1991. One day, I really went with her. Since the situation around me was very tense, I did not dare to reveal my ethnicity even to the priest, but I faithfully did everything I was told. Attended the services twice a week and did everything the local priest suggested me to do. I went through the rituals of baptism, confession, and communion. Also, I bought an icon and a book of prayers and read certain prayers from it before the icon every day. About 1 year had passed in this way. Besides regular liturgies, which were repeated unchanged, the priest rarely, but it happened when he delivered brief sermons after a service. On one such occasion, he delivered a proverb that remained in my memory. This is the content of it. A man, while walking on his way, came across a crystal clean river. The cleanliness of the river so caught his attention that he began to walk along it to find its source. When he reached the beginning of the river, he saw that the source of that transparent and clean river was a certain decayed animal. The explanation and moral of the proverb was that a priest may have some flaws and be like a decayed animal, but despite of that clean river of spirit will always flow from him. At that time, that explanation of the proverb slipped my mind, because for me, being born in an atheistic state, everything that was related to God and His truth was new, and any compromise or flaw regarding it was beyond any my imagination. One day, I asked the priest for an explanation of a certain Bible verse. I could not even imagine the possible development of things that followed my question, because I never would have thought I needed special permission to read the Bible. Before that, the priest seemed like a calm person, but after my question, he got so angry that he completely lost control of himself and was screaming in a loud voice, accusing some people whom I actually did not even know of trying to take me away from the Orthodox belief. He was shouting that some perverted people seduced me to read the Bible. I was told I had to stop reading it because I could never understand it myself. The fact that reading the very words of Christ was forbidden for Christians seemed incredible to me. I did not pay attention to his words and continued to read it as I did before. Now I have to touch on the story of my middle brother in a few words. He was 2 years older than me and was born a healthy child. As he grew up, he became a little bit introvert, but nothing seemed alarming. After graduation from the secondary school, he was called up for military service. He served near the border between Poland and Eastern Germany, which at that time was called as the Democratic Republic of Germany. Since it was a very secret military unit of the Soviet army, in some cases, soldiers were even prohibited from sending letters to their families. After 2 years of service there, when he returned, he was physically changed. We learned from him that during the military training, there was an accident, and his and 2 more other soldiers' gas masks failed to work. Because of it, 1 soldier died on the spot, another lost his mental stability, and my brother survived after 6 months of treatment in military hospital. We had not been informed about that accident until he finished his term and came back. Even after that incident, he worked for a certain institution for a couple of years and everything seemed to be in order. Soon after that, wars and conflicts erupted in Georgia. He lost his job, then gradually began to withdraw into himself and finally spent all his time in his room. It was clear there was something wrong with him. My father took him to a very good specialist of that field, but nothing helped. He himself had also been fighting, still having some desires and plans, but unfortunately it was almost impossible to change something during the tense times, and his condition was worsening as time passed. The problem of my brother was one of those I prayed for, lit candles, and wrote his name down to be also prayed during Orthodox liturgy. One person of that local congregation suggested me to speak about my brother's problem to another Orthodox priest who, according to her, was much stronger spiritually, but without revealing my ethnicity, because that priest was very sensitive to that issue. I went to that priest and had been waiting a long time for him to come out of his room, and when he did, I told him about my brother's problem into 3 sentences as quickly as I could. He advised me to light the longest candle in front of a particular icon and read psalms at home, and continued his way. I fulfilled the first part of his advice immediately. But the second part about the Psalms was uncertain for me because I did not know what particular Psalms he meant by them. The New Testament book which I had was published with Psalms. I thought those Psalms were supposed to be the ones I was suggested to read. I do not remember exactly what psalm I was reading, but it reflected so sincere and close relationship with God that I was absolutely astonished. It was something completely different from my prayer book, the content of which seemed quite strange and unfamiliar to me. That experience was something new to me. A person was speaking directly to God in a clear and immediate way. It was the first time I felt something new and real. At the same time, my other relatives also tried to help my brother. The Orthodox priests they had a relationship with considered the baptism ritual as a necessary step for my brother. As I learned from my mother later, the priest even set a deadline for my brother to give his consent for the baptism ritual. Unfortunately, that deadline became the deadline of his life itself, as he committed suicide exactly at that day. All our family tried to help him, but unfortunately, his life ended tragically. When my brother died, the war was still going in Georgia. It was the spring of 1993. Because of the war, in the cemetery where my brother was buried, at least a few young men were buried every day. When my mother, who was in deep despair, saw so many young people at the age of her son buried every day, she was so stunned by that sight. She even said that place looked not as a cemetery, but as a place of life. There was so much darkness and death around me that even now I do not like black and dark colors. After my brother died, I was told that he would definitely go to hell, and I began a new journey into new religious rituals. For no reason, those years became the years when almost everything was against me. It was like darkness hovered over me, trying to destroy me completely, and my strength was definitely not enough to stand against it. At that point in my life, to accept certain religious rituals became increasingly difficult for me. For example, I could not believe that a ritual over a certain food that was performed for a deceased one could alter God's eternal judgment for that person. What if somebody does not have anyone to do it for him? God must be just and the same for everyone. I thought on the way home after one of those rituals. Time passed, but there was no change around me. At that time, I was working for a magazine. Those were the first years when Soviet Union as a state no longer existed and Georgia as an independent state was taking its first steps. We had not even had new Georgian passports and national currency yet. Public transport was scarce and we had to walk for 2, 3, 4 hours just to get to work or back home. One day, shortly after my brother's death, after walking for hours and being very tired, I finally came home and took the prayer book to recite the same prayer I had already known by heart, since I had been reading it for about a year. I did not plan anything beforehand, but a protest arose and broke out from inside of me, and I could no longer read the same prayer. I was totally engulfed with that protest, but protest against whom? Was it against people? No, there was no point in doing that. Was it against the deep darkness around me that seemed impossible to overcome despite all my attempts? No, it did not make sense to me either. I had already tried it. It had already been my past. I started realizing it was the protest against God Himself, because it seemed it was the only thing left. I threw down my prayer book, all the religious books, my New Testament book that I had been reading for over a year, and even some of my professional mass books. I threw down everything that was near me at that moment. The word just started gushing out of me. I was speaking with all my voice and tears. Apart from my prayer book, I knew no other prayer, but I remembered my experience while I was reading the Psalms, where a man spoke directly to God. That everything was happening spontaneously. I was addressing directly to God, since I thought there was nothing left for me. I did not ask God for lots of money or some special career. All I asked for was a decent human life, when I would not be like a toy swept away by the cruel tides of this life and smashed against the cliffs, being deprived of all dignity for reasons that were beyond my control. I questioned Him about the reason and purpose of creating me. I asked Him the purpose of why I was born on this earth. With a loud voice, I was speaking to God, saying that if He really existed, He could not be the God of fruitless rituals, and I could not pray any longer the same unanswered prayers from the prayer book. Back then, I knew almost nothing about His ways, but even me, a young woman born in an atheistic country, understood that if God really existed, He had to hear my prayer and answer it. I said to Him, if He really existed, He could not be several, but the only one. I told Him I did not agree having a life of slavery and worthlessness. I told that I was a human and He was God, and I needed Him as real and true, not as dead, but as a living God. I said if He did not answer me, I would give my life back to Him, which had been ruined and stripped of its dignity. And if Hell really existed, He would not have a moral right to blame me, as all my attempts to find a solution were before Him. I do not encourage anyone to do the same, but it is my story and I cannot change it. Thank God that His grace was sufficient to cover my human understanding at that moment. Everything happened in a spontaneous way. I was praying with a loud voice and tears, and finally, being tired, I somehow fell asleep.